So I'm afraid that I have to chair this session, so you don't get relieved of my voice just yet. We have 4 15-minute papers, and we will have the discussion after the papers. And then only a short break after that, followed by another session. So it's very important that we keep to time. So without any further ado, can I introduce Zoja Bojić, and she will speak about what she has on screen, Philostrati. And everyone, all speakers, please remember the 15-minute rule.
Can you hear me better now? Yes, I assume so. Well, I'm really thrilled to participate in this conference, and especially in this very place where some other conferences of the Classics Association of Serbia took place in the past, and I feel amongst the friends. So thank you very much for having organized this conference in which so many of us are participating. My talk today is on Philostrati and the values of good governance. Who are the Philostrati? Some of us who have been following some current research in the field of art history and art historiography of the European antiquity would be quite familiar with them. Philostrati are Philostratus the Elder and Philostratus the Younger, the grandfather and the grandson. Whether Philostratus the Elder, the person whom we assume lived in the 2nd century AD, is the same Philostratus who wrote some other manuscripts at the time or not, we cannot be absolutely certain. So we're looking at Philostratus the Elder as the author of a book called Imagines or Icones that deal exclusively with descriptions of paintings. There are very few ancient texts that actually are dedicated to the visual arts, to the paintings themselves, and this is one of those. Amongst the others, we can start with historically Vitruvius, 1st century BC, who wrote on architecture, of course, but also on other aspects of visual arts. He wrote it in a particular manner, a manner of a person who was actually a builder, and therefore those texts are from that perspective, written from that perspective, and should be read from that perspective too. Then, of course, we have Pliny the Elder, who wrote not necessarily on paintings themselves, but on the history of painting, history of painters, as well as, of course, history of sculpture and sculptors, and the architects too. The next, he lived in the 1st century AD. Then we have Philostratus the Elder. It's very neat, actually. Philostratus the Elder, 2nd century AD. Philostratus the Younger, 3rd century AD. And Callistratus, who is presumed to have lived in the 3rd or 4th century AD. Callistratus wrote on sculpture, and we are not going to be mentioning him much today. Philostratus the Elder wrote Imagines. His grandson, Philostratus the Younger, also wrote a group of texts also called Imagines. And obviously Philostratus the Younger, as he says so in his foreword to his book, emulates his grandfather and wishes to achieve that level of knowledge and transmit that knowledge about the paintings. There is a big difference between the two Philostrati. the main difference is that the Philostratus the Elder was obviously a philosopher. Philostratus the Younger was not. Philostratus the Elder says so in his introduction. And he says that he finds himself in Naples, the beautiful Greek city of Naples, attending a philosophy conference where he comes across a rich person with a beautiful villa within which paintings are displayed. It is assumed that most of those paintings would not be fresco paintings on the walls, not murals, but actually those done on wooden panels or some other kind of panels. This is quite important for us art historians and other art lovers amongst us, as most of the preserved material, visual material of antiquity of that period and earlier periods actually are not paintings, are simply mural paintings, or of course works done in other mediums such as, for example, mosaics and so on. Philostratus the Elder describes some 54 paintings that he comes across in this gallery, private gallery, in a private house that is ordinarily not shown to general public. And he writes about these paintings for the general public. But he uses a character of a young boy who lives in this house to explain to him, and through these explanations to explain to his readership and therefore to us, what these paintings were about. Amongst the paintings, we can categorize them in any one way that we wish. For example, there are those that he describes that are still alive, that represent still life, and that are called xenia, meaning, of course, the gifts that the hosts give to guests when they arrive. But in real terms, of course, they're still alive. Then there would be those that depict heroines, then although they're not categorized as such within that interior in which they are displayed. The paintings are actually displayed not necessarily only in the interior, but in some kind of an open gallery space through which Philostratus, with his young student, are passing through. As you read through these, you come across other observers. It's not just this young boy that Philostratus is talking to, but also a group of young people who joins them. This is of a very of a high importance to us, because we are looking today at those values that Philostratus the Elder tries to tell us about, and in this particular instance, the values of good governance that are displayed in one way or another in these paintings. Some scholars in the past believed Philostratus the Elder described the paintings that never existed, and that there were no paintings whatsoever. He invented the whole thing. He invented the gallery, he invented the villa, he invented even the artworks. Now, as an art historian, I must disagree with this, because the visual material that we have of antiquity, Greek, Roman, 2nd century AD, and of course way earlier, proves the opposite. Yes, it is true, we do not have as many wonderful compositions that obviously are described by Philostratus the Elder as well as Philostratus the Younger. But we do have visual arts materials from that had been preserved. For example, Greek vases, where we have exactly the same compositions, only significantly simplified. We also have records such as Pliny the Elder's records on the artists and their artworks, and therefore we must assume that such artworks, even if not these very artworks from that very villa in that very town of Naples, did exist nevertheless. And we must believe that what Philostratus the Elder says about them is actually true, because it would be true for many other artworks from the previous eras or that era, executed in different mediums and in different manners. Now, Philostratus the Elder never ever says anything about the governance as such, but in showing these artworks to his young student and other group of young people, he actually tells them, teaches them, that's an educational tour, not a touristic tour, through this gallery that he takes his audience on. And he teaches this young fellow to the values of various ethical issues, political issues, real life issues, as well as something that is of utmost importance to art historian, the aesthetical issues, that is, the values of the visual arts. But today, we will be looking exclusively as to what he has to say about the governance, not the ruler as such. He doesn't ever talk about any one particular specific ruler, except as we will see in the last color slide that I will be showing right now, but that would be the last one. In between, he doesn't talk about the rulers as such. The topics of the paintings are different from, as I said, Xenia, to various mythological compositions, various historical compositions, of course, heroic deeds of various heroes, and so on. And he uses each and every one of them as an educational tool. If we divide them as per this category of governance, we can therefore have to discard some of the really important educational texts on how to be a leader, who is the leader, how to become one. And actually we have that kind of an example in a beautiful hunting scene that is described by Philostratus, which actually kind of ties in with the hunting scene that we have seen earlier today. I was not going to use any such examples of the leadership and leaders, because in this painting that Philostratus describes, the hunter is just the leader of the group rather than a ruler. Hunting is just a game. It's in this particular instance, in that particular description of that particular painting, there is no ruling, there are no kings, it's just a group of young men hunting. But if we look at the rulers that he actually mentions, except for the, as I said, last slide that I will leave for later on, he actually, firstly, if he mentions any rulers, he mentions women rulers. If they are not rulers, they are the wives of the rulers, and they are as famous for different deeds of their own as their husbands. Let us walk through some of the pictures that I have prepared for you. This is Rodogun, the historical character, a wife of a ruler, and who later of Parth, and who later on became a subject of various writings and various paintings of the much later centuries, but of which we have no record of Philostratus' own time. At one stage, she picks up her armory and she heads off to the battle. Philostratus writes about Cassandra, and of course the story of Cassandra we all know. I'm trying to get rid of this one. Is it better now? Yes. The story of Cassandra, of course we all know, but yes, we know her as a descendant of the royal family. We have the story of Evadne or Euadne, who threw herself upon the death of her husband, of course the ruler. We've got Panthea, who also commits a suicide after the death of her husband, the ruler. And then we have a category of young princesses who were rescued, damsels in distress, who were rescued. Philostratus the Elder writes about Perseus and his rescuing of the young princess. And we've got in Philostratus the Younger the story of Hesione, who was rescued by Heracles. The artworks that literally depict the fruits of the good government versus the chaos of the bad government is actually an artwork of which we do not have an example later on, but that goes back all the way to Homer, of course. Philostratus the Younger, in one of his texts, describes the shield of Achilles. And even if we don't really know with certainty what that shield might have looked like, and it has been the topic of investigation of so many scholars from so many different fields, including Professor Sima Avramović. Thank you. We know that it does depict, and we know this because Philostratus the Younger tells us that this painting that depicts the shield of Achilles actually depicts the good governance versus the bad governance. And finally, the one that I have been promising to you, I think I've got only a couple of minutes left, is that right? One. All right, within this 1 minute. This is a wonderful, much later, of course, representation of Themistocles, Philostratus the Elder's story of, indeed, a politician, a Greek politician, who finds himself at the Persian court. And the juxtaposition of the Persian way of ruling and the Greek mind, democratic mind that is described in this particular text by Philostratus is that what qualifies the ruler to be a Greek ruler and a ruler to be an Asian, other Persian ruler. Because this is the end of my presentation today, I will have to conclude. But in my written text, of course, I will be examining all of these stories in much greater detail. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We should move directly now to Petar Nurkić and his topic, while it's being put up on screen, Greek Paideia as a prerequisite for a good ruler, the image of Constantius, Chlorus, and Julian the Apostate through early Christian panegyrics.
Thank you. So a lot of people, a lot of well-educated people, so this is a bit terrifying for me, but I will do my best. I think I'm the only philosopher here, so don't judge me for historical inaccuracies and a bit of gaps. I will talk about, I changed actually my case study to Constantine the Great rather than his father, although there are panegyrics that are pointed toward his father, Chlorus. And I will talk about Greek Paideia as a prerequisite or precondition for a good ruler. And I will focus on Constantine and Julian and their conversations with Paideia thinkers of their time, and just the significance of those conversations through panegyrics. So, short overview, I will tell what is Paideia and how we can define it or not by focusing on Jaeger and Marot, and I will shortly talk about Greek understanding of a good ruler, and I will present panegyrics of Themistius, Nilus, and Libanus, and then I will conclude my point at the end. So Paideia is really peculiar concept of ancient Greek culture and education, and second sophists like Plutarch, for example, say that Paideia is a key element of Greek culture in Roman era. So for me, it is important to give a parallel between Greek culture and Roman era, so we can define it statically or dynamically. If we take statical approach, then Paideia means education and integration in society as a consequence of this type of education. And in the dynamics concept, we take a whole cultural context and the context that is conditioned by the Greek identity in the Roman era. It is very difficult to define Paideia because it really means a broad sort of things like moral standards, culture, and all kind of technical spectrum like arts, mythology, religion, medicine also. So we have two authority on Paideia. One is Jaeger and other is Marot. We can see their book on the left side, and main difference between them is Acme Paideia period. Jaeger thought that was Hellenism, and Marot moved the significant period of Paideia to Roman Empire, and they did not really define Paideia in technical sense, because not defining Paideia allows us to focus on more important aspects and not just technical terms like curriculae or something else. So Jaeger has 3 books on history of education, and he really appreciates the Greek foundation of education, even for contemporary education. He, as I told so, did not provide any specific definition. He considered a broader framework of Paideia as an ideal in the Greek culture, and he spoke extremely positively about Plato's model of education, molding of youth and cultural shaping of youth. And he and also Marot thinks of Paideia as humanism and try to connect it with virtue, and what kind of virtue do Paideia lead us on. Marot also, he was different than Jaeger because he focused on special figures, special historical figures. He reconstructed the cultural man of Roman art, and his ideal Paideia man is cosmopolitan. He is free from authorities, and he is well aware of his rights and needs. And for Marot, characteristic is that he see Paideia as something for higher group of people who put themselves in noble service of higher power or state of Rome and Catholic Church. What is meant to be a good ruler? Briefly, for philosopher king is a very old idea, and ruler for Greeks must be the one who leads by an example. He must rationale between going to war and when to be diplomatic, when to sustain from confrontations, and he needs to take into account people's opinion and so on. Also, the Greeks had a lot of deities, so it was very important to respect all of those deities for people to be happy. And some of the examples from Sophocles, Hesiod, and Homer, and Euripides of good rulers are Priam, Achilles, Oedipus. And why is Paideia a prerequisite of a good ruler? Because good ruler must balance between true leadership and military autocracy. Greek went through a really turbulent periods. They lost state power, freedom, citizenship, and only thing that could not be taken away from them is specific spirit of Hellenistic culture or Paideia. So Constantine the Great, I will fast forward this. Everyone knows who Constantine is. I just will shortly note that he is the first emperor to convert to Christianity, and he really enacted numerous reforms. He straightened the empire, combated inflation, reconstructed the government. He was baptized, we all know, for Edict of Milan and Council of Nicaea, and he was the first Christian emperor. He really pushed Christianity toward mainstream culture in Roman era. Julian also was very educated emperor for his time. He was notable philosopher and author that spoke and wrote in Greek. He was military commander, theosophist, social reformer, and man of letters. So what are panegyrics? Those are praiseworthy orations. Prominent Paideia thinkers wrote this oration and were pushed to emperor himself. And this point out to a really interesting connection between culture, Greek culture, and political power in early Roman era. And I will note this citation: no person shall obtain a post of first rank unless it shall be proved that he excels in long practice of liberal studies and that he is so polished in literary matters that words flow flawlessly from his pen. This is a jointly issued edict of Constantine and Julian, and we can see that an uneducated person could not enjoy the high positions in Roman Empire. They had to acquire education and familiarity with the Greek culture. And I will present three pagan thinkers, interesting pagan thinkers that managed to acquire those high positions in Roman Empire by writing to Constantine and Julian. So Themistius is first example of successful orator. He wrote to Constantine and he flattered him, and he really used some rhetorical tricks because he noted that he does not provide flattering for money, but he cares about the values that Constantine and he share, and those values are self-control, courage, sanity, philanthropy, all the values that make emperor a godlike. So Themistius really instruct Constantine how to be a really great ruler. And Constantine brought him back and wrote actually a letter to wrote a letter to Senate, nominated him for senator, and Constantine demonstrated really rich acquaintance with Greek culture, and this was actually a dialogue, not just an answer to Themistius' letters. So I'm near the end, so I will. Nilus Dionysius had really a bad correspondence with Julian. When Julian was not an emperor, he was a senator. He refused Julian's proposition because Julian wanted to gather cultural figures around him. And after Julian became an emperor, Nilus wrote him back and accepted his offering, but Julian insulted him in many ways, calling him a prostitute and a chair warmer, and this was not very good for Nilus. This is an example where he crossed himself badly. Libanus, at the end, he's example of someone who passed the Julian cultural text. He is also an example why Greek culture was very much alive, not only in classrooms, but through politics, orations, and lobbying. And Greek culture was very much alive, but had to be performed. So my conclusion is that Roman emperors could not be a good rulers without Paideia, and Paideia thinkers could not express themselves if they didn't wrote to Paideia, with Paideia thinkers, and panegyrics was a form of practicing Paideia in this sense. So I'm very sorry for probably my bad pronunciation of these historical figures and maybe some historical inaccuracy. I'm more interested in framework than in details, and sorry for the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so we need to move now directly to Dragana Dimitrijević. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint. A handout. So her subject is Too Wise to be an Emperor, Self-Image and Otherness in Emperor Julian's Misopogon. And I don't know if I pronounced that right.
So our colleague Petar Nurkić gave me starting point because I will talk about Julian. And all of you have handouts, I suppose. Now all of you have. The Emperor Julian came to Antioch on his way to Persia in the autumn of 362 and stayed there till March 363. For the emperor, the last months of the last year and the first of the second were a period not only of intense military preparations. In March, Julian set out on his expedition against the Sassanian Empire, from which he would not return alive, and of conflict with the mostly Christian populace of Antioch, but also of strenuous literary activity. Only a few days before the hymn to King Helios, he wrote his satire Symposium, and between mid-January and mid-February in 363, he probably last major text, the curious satire Misopogon, saw the light of the day. Antioch was rich and important commercially, but in Julian's eyes, she was frivolous. Julian's behavior at Antioch and his failure to integrate himself with the citizens has been viewed as one of the causes of the failure of his pagan restoration. His mistake was that he was always reminding the common people that the true knowledge of the gods is reserved for philosophers, and even the pagans did not share his zeal for philosophy. The Antiochians satirized him in Apostate verses and either stayed away from the temples that he restored, or when they did attend in response to his summons, showed by their untimely applause of the emperor that they had not come to worship his gods. Julian's answer was the satire on himself entitled Misopogon, Beard Hater, which he addresses directly to the people of Antioch. After he had left the city, the citizens repented and sent a deputation to make their peace with him, but he could not forgive the insults to himself or that he had been displayed to the gods. This paper is an attempt to take Julian's words in the Misopogon not just as a product of Julian's literary talent, even he was talented, but also as the display of his self-image and identity, on the one hand, and the disclosure of his views about the Antiochians, about the others, and Otherness on the other hand. The background against this paper is conceived is the view that Julian's work could be interpreted with the lenses of psychology and sociology. Before going any further, let us define the self-concept according to the principles of social psychology. The self-concept is a knowledge representation that contains knowledge about us, and since it is the most important of all our schemas, it has an extraordinary degree of influence on our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Although each person has a unique self-concept, we can identify some characteristics that are common for all people. Our physical characteristics are important to our self-concept because we realize that other people use them to judge us. A second aspect of the self-concept relating to personal characteristics is made up of specific and stable personality characteristics that describe an individual. For example, I'm humble, I'm rigid, etc. The remainder of the self-concept reflects its more external social components. For example, memberships in the social groups that we belong to and care about, which form an important part of the self-concept because they provide us with our social identity, the sense of ourself that involves our memberships in social groups. This paper aims to show how these three broad categories of characteristics, physical, personal, and social, could be applied to our better understanding of deeper psychological patterns which lie behind Julian's words about himself in the Misopogon. Thus, Julian's statements about himself and the Antiochians will be sorted out according to those three categories. As mentioned above, the first aspect of the self-concept is related to physical characteristics of a person, and it takes us to the title itself, Misopogon, beard hater. Let us see a few examples from the satire that are connected to Julian's physical appearance, which had met strong opposition from the people of Antioch and was contrary to their own, of course, according to Julian's interpretation. Now, as for praising myself, I should be very glad to do so. I have no reason for that, but for criticizing myself, I have countless reasons. And first, I will begin with my face. For though nature did not make this any too handsome or well-favored, or give it the bloom of youth, I myself, out of sheer perversity and ill temper, have added to it this long beard of mine, to punish it, and it would seem for this very crime of not being handsome by nature. And the second example, but you say that I ought to twist ropes from the beard. Well, I am willing to provide you with ropes, if only you have the strength to pull them, and their roughness does not dreadful damage to your unworn and tender hands. Since Julian chose the form of satire to communicate with the Antiochians, it is obvious that the disclosure of his self-concept revealed in these two examples should not be understood literally, but rather as a product of his irritation and consequently as a product of his irony. It is well known that irony is used in situations when an author wants to express his or her disagreement and thus a therapeutic tool for expressing his feelings. Let us see two more examples of Julian's depiction of himself and the peoples of Antioch. But you, since even in your old age you emulate your own sons and daughters by your soft and delicate way of living, or perhaps your effeminate dispositions carefully make your chin smooth, and your manhood you barely reveal, and slightly indicate by your forehead, or by your jaws, as I do. And if you would like to learn something that is usually a secret, my breast is shaggy and covered with hair, like the breasts of lions, who among wild beasts are monarchs like me. I will go back to the field of social psychology. We see that we develop our self-concept through comparison to other people. Social comparison theory states that we describe and evaluate ourselves in terms of how we compare to other people and comparisons are based on two dimensions: superiority, inferiority, and similarity and difference. All those examples clearly show that in terms of superiority and inferiority, Julian doesn't judge himself to be inferior, for sure, nor similar to the people of Antioch. Quite contrary, Julian's comparisons with the Antiochians reveal his notion of being superior and different. Thus, these comparisons positively affect his self-esteem and were incorporated in his self-concept. Furthermore, these examples show that the Misopogon could be read against the background of social constructionism and social identity theory, with its main dimension, sameness and otherness, in terms of we or I and they. As we have said at the beginning, besides physical, there are two more broad categories, personality and social characteristics, which have an impact on our self-concept, self-image, and self-esteem. Let us see what Julian says related to his personal traits as opposed to the people of Antioch. I'm not content with having my body in this rough condition, but in addition, the mode of life that I practice is very strict indeed. I banish myself from the theater, such a dolt I am. And even when I do enter the theater, I look like a man who is expiating a crime. And another example, but all these things are externals. And indeed, what a small fraction of my offenses against you have I ascribed. But to turn to my private life within the court, sleepless nights on a pallet and a diet that is anything rather than suffering make my temper harsh and unfriendly to luxurious city like yours. However, it is not in order to set an example to you that I adopt these habits, but in my childhood a strange and senseless delusion came over me and persuaded me to war against my belly, so that I do not allow it to fill itself with a great quantity of food. There is no room for detailed analysis of these two quotations, but thus far it is easy to conclude that Marcus Aurelius is obviously a model of what Julian himself wanted to be, a great philosopher king. Proof of that are a number of philosophical texts that Julian wrote, mainly during his rather brief time as sole ruler, and his need to highlight his philosophical education and inclination. Julian deliberately chose the more uncompromising Stoic model of the wise man, rather than some milder variant, in order to underline its radical opposition to the habits of the people of Antioch. Just to give a hint on the Stoic doctrine in order to make Julian's words more understandable. The Stoics believed that the only good was virtue, the only evil vice, and all other things were classified as adiaphora or indifference, including living conditions. So Julian presents himself as very close to the Stoic ideal, whereas the negative examples and description of behavior of the Antiochians serve as its antipodes. He goes on to elaborate the idea a bit further while describing his staying at Lutetia. I happened to be in winter quarters at my beloved Lutetia, for that is how the Celts call the capital of the Parisians. The winter then was more inclement than usual, but the room where I slept was not warmed in the way that most houses are heated. I mean by furnaces underground. And that too, though it was conventionally arranged for letting in heat from such a fire. But it so happened, I suppose, because I was awkward and as a now, and displayed inhumanity first of all, as was natural towards myself. Then Julian employs a well-known rhetorical feature, imagined direct speech of the people of Antioch, which serves as another argument in his invective against the Antiochians. What then, you answer? Did you really suppose that your boorish manners and savage ways and clumsiness would harmonize with these things? Oh, most ignorant and most wholesome of men! Is it so senseless and it's so stupid, that pure soul of yours, which men of poor spirit call temperate, and which you first think it your duty to adorn and deck out with temperance? You are wrong, for in the first place we don't know what temperance is, and we hear its name only, while the real thing we cannot see. But if the sort of thing that you now practice, if it consists in knowing that men must be enslaved to the gods and laws, if in short temperance is really this sort of thing, then you have ruined yourself, and moreover you are ruining us. Finally, here is an example which reveals the difference between Julian and Antiochians, considering the third social category of characteristics connected to the self-concept. Antiochians are Christians, while Julian is pagan, who worships old pagan gods. Julian took his role of Pontifex Maximus, which had been a part of the Roman emperor's responsibilities since Augustus, and which not even Constantius had discarded. Very serious indeed. Julian aimed to improve religious practices and moral behavior, not just of the people of Antioch, but rather of the empire. How confidently can we use Julian's Misopogon as an indication of the emperor's thoughts and values against which we can measure his political and religious agenda? It's hard to tell. One thing is certain, this satire was written in a hurry, which may explain some of its shortcomings, which are most apparent in structuring and connection of thought. Nevertheless, it provides us with fascinating insights into Julian's personality and the things said that are a considerable part of what makes him a quite unique historical figure. That's it.
Thank you very much. So we must move on to keep going to Zachary Chitwood, King of the Mountain, Medieval Hagiorite Perspectives on Ideal Rulership.
It should be open. Just go to share screen. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you. So, first of all, I would like to thank the members of the organizing committee for accepting my paper, and it's a pleasure to be here in Belgrade. As an entree into the subject of medieval Hagiorite, and with Hagiorite, by the way, I mean the holy mountain, Mount Athos, which I'll explain in greater detail in a second, of medieval Hagiorite perspectives regarding ideal rulership in Byzantium, it might be worth making a few general remarks about Mount Athos. As most of you have probably heard of Mount Athos, I'll just say a few things about it. It is a semi-autonomous monastic republic in northern Greece, which lies about 100 kilometers distant from Thessaloniki. Today, it is home to 20 principal monasteries and some 2,200 monks. Mount Athos has a long history not only of organized monasticism, but also a rich institutional history. Contours of its semi-autonomous political status were already discernible by the end of the 9th century, and this nominal independence in many respects took on its full form by the middle of the 10th century. It managed to retain its self-governing status throughout the centuries that followed, including its subordination to the Patriarchate of Constantinople at the beginning of the 14th century and rule by newer political powers in the Balkans in the later medieval period, including a phase of Serbian rule during the 14th century and a very long period of Ottoman suzerainty that lasted from the end of the Middle Ages into the 20th century. As a crossroads of different cultures and languages, Mount Athos housed substantial communities of monks from Byzantium, from the Slavic world, Bulgarian, Serbs, and Rus, from the Caucasus, especially Georgia, and also from the Latin West. As such, although it continued to maintain a special relationship with the Byzantine emperor until the end of the empire's existence, the Holy Mountain was also patronized from rulers throughout the Orthodox world, and indeed beyond it. With regard to the topic of our conference, I propose to investigate in this paper how the monastic communities of Mount Athos defined ideal rulership in a positive sense, as well as what traits or actions disqualified a person from serving as emperor. Along these lines, I will offer Hagiorite views of ideal rulership at two critical junctures in the Holy Mountain's history. The first, during the rise of the great communal monasteries on Mount Athos in the 10th century, and the second at the time of the hesychastic controversy in the middle of the 14th century. As a preface to the first part of my presentation, it is worth mentioning that monks and emperors had already had close interactions dating from the time of Justinian. To give just one example, in Cyril of Scythopolis' Life of Sabas, Sabas went to Constantinople twice, first in 511 during the reign of Anastasius, and the second time to the court of Justinian, to request aid in rebuilding Palestine after the Samaritan revolt. During the first mission, Sabas received 1,000 gold coins from the emperor for the monasteries under his care, while during the second mission, he was asked by the emperor if he needed a state subsidy for the monasteries which he supported, or which were under his authority. And Sabas refused, instead asking for 5 specific favors. And in return for this imperial succor, Sabas prophesied that by God's grace, Justinian would reconquer the territories lost since the time of the Emperor Honorius, including North Africa and Rome, in order to extirpate the Arian heresy. During his sojourns at the imperial court in Constantinople, Sabas adopted an exceedingly deferential tone and gave the emperor no specific advice on how to rule. This pattern of monastic deference in the presence of the emperor, with advice, quote unquote, such as it were, being limited to prophecy, lasted, I would say, until after iconoclasm. The unique history of the founding of the principal monastic community on Mount Athos, the Great Lavra, seems to have caused a shift in the paradigm of monastic advice to rulers in the Byzantine context. Before the founding of the Great Lavra in 963, Athos was already an important monastic center, though it was by no means preeminent, nor did it appear to have special advantages over its fellow monastic centers that would have guaranteed its rise to prominence. And here on this map, you can see some of the other monastic centers in the Byzantine world at that time, and particularly prominent are those in Western Asia Minor. The key figure in Athos's rise to prominence was Athanasius the Athonite. He was born in Trebizond, and he received his higher education in Constantinople. And he received his monastic formation on one of these monastic centers in Western Asia Minor, on Mount Kimanas here, which I'm not sure if my laser pointer is working. 1 second. Yes, here. And it was during this time that he met the members of the Phocas family. One of whose members, Nicephorus Phocas, would later become emperor. And according to a version of Athanasius's life, his Vita, already while Athanasius was a monk, Nicephorus approached him and confided that he wanted to enter the monastic life under his tutelage. Though Nicephorus's meteoric rise as a successful general prevented him from acting upon this vow immediately, he repeated his wish to become a monk shortly after he had conquered Crete at the conclusion of the 960-961 campaign, where Athanasius, who had in the meantime moved to Athos, visited him. Here Nicephorus promised that he would provide funds for the construction of a small monastery under Athanasius's leadership, which Nicephorus would join in due course. The matter of this vow would eventually cause much anguish, for shortly later, in 963, Nicephorus, who had to this point been a very successful general, acquired the imperial throne, thus seemingly breaking his promise to become a monk for good. Nonetheless, after his initial disappointment, Athanasius made the journey to Constantinople to visit the now emperor Nicephorus, and decided not only to forgive him, but also to give him some specific advice. And the relevant passage, and this is from the so-called Paideia of Athanasius, reads as follows. The father, so Athanasius, was pleased by these pious words, so Nicephorus's repentance, even though he knew that they would not come to pass in the end. And seeing his great contrition and repentance, decided it was not right to break a bruised reed, something which not even Nathan had done to David. Instead, he forgave him at once and advised him to conduct himself as a private citizen, an idiotis, simply and humbly, to confess and repent every day to God, both of his other sins, as well as for not staying true to him. In addition, he recommended that he be compassionate to those who had run afoul of his power, and to always give alms. And so Athanasius advised him in these matters. Yet, to his confidants, he predicted that Nicephorus would lose his life while still emperor, so he knew that he would never become a monk. Though this passage from Athanasius's Vita followed the trope of prophecy of the fate of the emperor found in the hagiographical accounts of Sabas and other prominent monks of earlier times, it introduced a new dimension by having the monk dispense advice to the emperor. Of course, this fact was in part prompted by the unusual situation of Athanasius being the confessor and spiritual confidant of Nicephorus before he attained the throne. Though even at this point, Nicephorus repeated his desire to eventually join Athanasius as a monk, he never did so, as Athanasius had foreseen, and was murdered by his fellow general John Tzimiskis in 969. Let us now turn to another period in Athenite history, to a time when the Byzantine Empire's political fortunes had taken a drastic turn for the worse. After the capture of Constantinople by the warriors of the Fourth Crusade in the year 1204, Athos was briefly under the rule of the new Latin Empire of Constantinople and was even placed under papal protection. Byzantine authority was reestablished there in the 1260s, and the new Paleologan dynasty had a keen interest in reestablishing the relationship between the Holy Mountain and the throne. By the middle decades of the 14th century, a prolonged period of civil strife in the Byzantine Empire had weakened imperial authority on Athos. The incursions of Turkish pirates were already a major problem, foreshadowing the eventual Ottoman takeover of the region, and the Holy Mountain was also subjected to a period of Serbian rule in the middle of the 14th century. It was in this turbulent period that Byzantine emperors, as far as we know, visited Athos for the first time. Their journey to Athos was recorded in the various versions of the life of Maximus the hut burner, who is a very interesting Hesychast saint. And Maximus had several extreme tendencies, and he was basically a hermit who really disliked crowds. And every time crowds of people would gather around him because of rumors about his sanctity, he would burn his dwelling, his hut, and that's how he acquired this moniker of hut burner. And the two emperors who visited him were John V Paleologos and John VI Cantacuzenios, who were co-emperors at that time. And after Maximus, the saint, foretold of many trials and tribulations which they both would experience as emperors, he gave them some specific advice. And that is this somewhat longer passage here. Even if you are rulers of the earth, you are still always obliged to look to the heavenly king and uphold his law like a heavenly scepter, to carry out his divine commandments first, and imitate him in all things to the best of your ability, as it is written in Scripture. Be instructed, all ye that judge the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice in him with trembling. Accept correction, lest at any time the Lord be angry, and ye should perish from the righteous way, whensoever wrath shall be suddenly kindled. In the same way, you are obliged to teach all your subjects faith, righteousness, truth, love, peace, and holiness, and to maintain the beauty and the power of the universal church, and preserve its honor for the sake of Christ in accordance with the command, and obligation to do so from above. Be compassionate toward those who are in sin, be patient with them all, have mercy on the poor, visit the sick, show love to the monks, and receive them as soldiers and friends of Christ, the Emperor of all, and give them what they need when they ask for it. See that you are not alarmed at the coming troubles, but endure them, so that you may obtain the crown of empire from Christ, our God in heaven, as well. Maximus then predicted that Cantacuzenios, so one of these two co-emperors, would become an abbot of a monastery, while Paleologos would have a long but weak and turbulent reign. And after their departure, Maximus, who was, as we've seen, an interesting character, he did a further gesture to confirm this prophecy. He sent a rusk, so twice-baked bread, sort of a cracker type thing, an onion, and a head of garlic to remind Cantacuzenios of his future monastic vocation. And at the point in his life where Cantacuzenios was deposed and forced to become a monk, he remembered these gifts, and he took a bite of this rusk, and he remembered Maximus's prophecy and marveled at it. So in conclusion, what are we to make of these two brief passages of advice given by Athenite saints to reigning Byzantine emperors? One question that deserves further analysis is how these Athenite admonitions fit within the quote-unquote mere for princes genre in the Byzantine tradition. Unlike those texts, and we heard about them actually in one of the earlier presentations, which were usually written by well-educated literati who conspicuously reference late antique models of rulership, the passages we have read today are more firmly rooted in monastic traditions of advice. No mention is made of the emperor's duties as a military leader, for instance, or as a lawgiver. Indeed, Athanasius even recommended that Nicephorus conduct himself like a private citizen, something that would be, I think, very unusual in these more usual mere for princes texts. The emperor was to be gentle and merciful to those under his power and give alms to the poor. Another difference with the mere for princes genre is that the advice of these Athenite saints was grounded in the gift of prophecy and foresight. Their admonitions must be read in the assumption of the readers of these texts that the monks knew the fates of the emperors they were advising. Given the limitations of time, I was unable to present notions of ideal rulership found in other texts associated with Athos, such as Typica, sort of monastic rules, foundation documents, imperial crucibles, or patriarchal documents. In addition, exploring this idea in other languages and cultures, such as Church Slavonic and Georgian, would be vital in presenting a more complete picture of Athenite notions of rulership. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and remarks.
Thank you very much, and we are only 2 or 3 minutes behind, so we've done well in the end. Now the floor is open to discussion of any of these 4 papers. I don't know if it will be helpful if we take them in order, but I think perhaps it's better just to see what questions people have. And all of those who gave papers, please be near a microphone so that you can answer on your paper.
Yes. Am I using microphone right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have a question to Dr. Zoja Bojić. And the question is, I will start a bit far, maybe away from the actual topic, but throughout the Middle Ages, there is a very important idea of paintings and pictures being as a Bible for illiterate. For example, if we can find it throughout, for example, epistles of Gregory the Great, or Church Fathers, because for Byzantine it was vital during the times of iconoclasm. And so, to my question, as I understood, Philostratus makes his text as an explanation of paintings. And of course, he explaining paintings about heroes and some with a kind of moral texts, maybe. And can you say, was it like an explanation of picture for the illiterate, like an explanation with didactic motifs, which was very important, as I said, for later medieval times?
Yes and no. In comparison to medieval times, that is quite a different situation. Here we have a private dwelling, a villa in Naples, nobody ever visits. Therefore, the paintings on the walls simply reflect the taste of the owner, and even Philostratus the Elder actually uses that line that they have been selected as per, in translation, particularly good taste. Now, the philosophers amongst us would jump up at the word taste, but being used way before its time. But nevertheless, that's what the idea is. So, no, that's a private person's or one family's selection of paintings that they really wanted to have in their own home. It was also assumed that some of these paintings could have also been within an interior that would correspond to their purpose. For example, where the food was prepared, or where there would be a food picture, or there would be a xenia picture of still life in the room dedicated to the guests. This is only a presumption, not by me, but by some of the previous researchers. So, no, there is no such thing. However, the mere fact that Philostratus is talking to a young boy and a group of young men is, in its own right, a paideia, text dedicated to educate, but not necessarily to prescribe something. Now, to us, these texts are like, not as in medieval times that Christ has to be represented in the manner A or the manner B. In particular composition, for example. No, we are not looking at iconography being taught here, but we are looking at something else being taught, in addition to all these other things that we talked about, such as the moral issues, the ethics, the etc. Also, the art of observing art. In Philostratus, you have, first of all, you have something that we call synesthetic feeling. That is, every painting that he describes, maybe not every, but many paintings that he describes, are such that he talks to the young boy and says, can you not hear the fall of this waterfall and the sound? It's not just the sound, it's let's approach this painting and collect the blood that has been coming out of it and dripping on the floor, etc. And there are many other instances of, do you know what they are singing about? And then he tells the actual topic of the song that is being sung. So this is just one of the examples, how Philostratus the Elder is also, in addition to teaching his young students various ethical, moral, etc. issues, he's also teaching them how to understand artworks, what to look for in artworks. And this is of utmost importance for art history, because it moves the date when the art history as a discipline was formed thousands of years earlier, or if you wish, art theory, or thinking about the visual arts in a broader way, in a philosophical way. It actually really moves it several thousand years earlier. That's an additional value of that text.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. I understand.
Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. Chitwood about the Holy Mountain. You said that there are West Latin monks in which monastery?
Sorry, could you, what sort of monks?
You said that on the Holy Mountain there are West Latin monks. In which monastery?
Yes, thank you for this question. There was during the medieval period, one very important Latin-speaking monastery, Amalfion. It's mentioned in a lot of documentation, and until around the year 1200, it was one of the three.
Before the Amalfian monastery does not exist for many centuries.
No, that is correct. No, I'm talking about the
That is
medieval period.
Perhaps in the first times of the Byzantine Empire.
It's
At that time.
right,
Before
Amalfion.
the schisma.
Yes.
Yes.
So, but no, Amalfion is important it's very important until 1200, and then it's abandoned shortly after
abandoned,
that.
yes.
Yes.
And it was before the schisma of the 11th century.
No, it was founded in the 10th century. Yes.
10th century, before the 11th century. That's why, because there are not any more West Latin monks on the Holy Mountain.
Yes, very true. So what I said about these monastic communities on Athos, that's mainly for the medieval period. Yeah. Georgian monks as well. I mean, there's not Iviron, which was a Georgian monastery, is not Georgian anymore.
Yes. The Hilandar, which is a Serbian, of course,
is
very
still
well
Serbian.
known.
Yeah.
And very rich monastery, and of course the Saint Panteleimon, the Russian monastery.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So now I would like to have a question to Mr. Nurkić. Excuse me, about Constantius Chlorus. But you have spoken about his son, Constantine. Am I right or not?
Yes, you're right. And at the beginning, I said that I changed the topic of my case study to his son, Constantine the Great.
Yes. Okay. So I would like also to ask you if you have studied also through the Helleniki Paideia the Hellenistic ideals, political ideals for the good governor. Because through the Hellenistic ideals, we have the norms for the good king, as Synesius says, because you spoke about Themisthius, but we have also the Christian writer Synesius.
Okay, thank you. There are really a lot of pagan thinkers that converted to Christianity after that. There is also Origen, and ideals for a good ruler have the Hellenistic origin. Yeah, there is not in the early Roman era. There is something new in ruling instruction for a good ruler, and that's some Christianity elements, but also in the foundation, Hellenistic ideals are most significant, and they are the foundation. And I didn't read all of those thinkers, pagan thinkers that wrote to emperors, but I will make my research more broader.
Mm-hmm. And the big difference between the emperor and the tyrant.
Yes. It's very important difference.
Yes, and very important. Allow me also to say something about Constantine the Great. Constantine the Great had not become a Christian. He was not a Christian emperor. We don't know even if he was baptized. There is a myth that when he was dying, he became Christian, he was baptized, but we don't know it. Constantine was a big political person. So he legitimated the Christian faith. The Christian religion became legitimate, one of the known religions in the Roman Empire. That's what he did. He was not a Christian emperor. We cannot select him in the Christian emperors. It was a political act because Constantine wanted to have political and social peace in the Roman Empire, and he could not have Christians out of this peace. It was the biggest part of the people of the empire. That's why he presided in the first ecumenical synod, but not as a Christian, but as the emperor, the head of the empire. And he said, I'm the head of the empire. I am the president of the ecumenical synod. I'm not a Christian, but I recognize Christians. That was the political act of Constantine and not a religious act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I agree, and I apologize at the beginning for my historical inaccuracy, but I also think that he was the emperor of Christians, but he didn't need to be a Christian to be emperor of Christians. Thank you very much.
Are there any more questions? We're on time now, but we have space for one or two more questions because we started a little bit late.
Thank you. A question to Zachary Chitwood. Could the commemoration books of Mount Athos, could they be used for the problem of acceptance, or not as a mirror of a good or bad ruler, of course, but for the source of some rulers had been accepted or not, in the sense of if a ruler is inscribed into a book, it doesn't mean that he was a good emperor or ruler, but he was accepted and venerated as such. But using ex silencio method, which is perhaps problematic, could it be used if some ruler is not in the book when we accept him to be inscribed, could it be useful as a kind of data?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Yes, I do think that the commemorative books could be used in this regard. And just as a quick remark on that question, we know that in the sources that the order of precedence in which rulers were to be commemorated was something that is talked about quite a lot. And actually, you can tie this to Serbian history when Stefan Dušan, who visited Mount Athos, he issued several crucibles, right? And in one of them, he confirmed all of the monasteries on Athos's privileges, and he said he stipulated that he would be commemorated, but after the Byzantine emperor. So the order of precedence is very important. I think that's another thing that that we have to keep in mind. Who is commemorated first and last, and that's something that the sources do talk about a bit.
Maybe one more.
My question is to Dragana Dimitrijević. Thank you for your report. As far as I know about the social identity theory, it's about social categorization and stereotypes of the members of in and out groups. So, and my question is about these personal representations in Misopogon. So, are the depiction of a personal identity or a member of a social group? So, what's the proportion between individual and social in our own self-representation, self-identification?
I think you are aware that that is a very hard question. So, and please don't expect for me to answer to this question today. But thank you for this question because it's important, and I think that I don't know if I could answer it today, but I will think about it. Thank you very much.
Right, well, I think it's now time for us to take our break, and then we have another session also with very tight-packed papers, so we need to be back soon. So thank you very much to everyone.
So a break until 12:30. There should be coffee and water, everything again. And please, if someone has a presentation from the next session, let's copy it in advance if you haven't already.